Yeah, hello everybody. This is George from Ireland. This is a video about whether the Labour Party could and should abolish independent schools in the United Kingdom. People sometimes call them private schools. Ugh, the nomenclature is very tricky. But anyway, the Labour Party in the United Kingdom just came out with a statement the other day because the Labour Party conference is on, it being conference season, and Labour have indicated they want to get rid of independent schools in the UK. So why they're called independent? Because they're not controlled by the state, they're not funded by the state. Now there is some state regulation governing them. You go back well to the beginning of education, and schools were just set up and the state had little to do with them, and schools were ecclesiastical foundations, not state foundations. But anyway, over the centuries, well, since the dissolution of the monasteries in England and the rest of the British Isles, the state took over schools. Some schools were run as businesses. They really are private schools, for-profit schools. There are not many of them, but the famous schools in the United Kingdom, the famous independent ones are often known as, are often called public schools, like Eton, Harrow, Winchester, Westminster School, St Paul's, Radley, Shrewsbury, Fettes College, Campbell College in Belfast, and on and on. Now they're open to the public just like the Ritz. They're open to you if you can pay, but there are scholarships and they're founded for poor scholars. Eton was founded for 70 poor scholars, and people say, yeah, but as many as 1,200 rich boys who go there. Not really poor scholars. Yeah, what else? And then they really ran their own show. But from certainly the 1860s onwards, the state began to encroach on their independence, and there was a Public Schools Act. There was a Clarendon Commission, chaired by Lord Clarendon, hence its name, into 9 of these leading public schools. I shan't name the 9 because I can't quite remember which ones it was. That's that. And then through the 20th century, the government arrogated to itself more and more control over independent schools, particularly in the 1990s, a big change. Up until the 1990s, the government had almost no say over what was done in independent schools. Obviously, the teachers, they weren't allowed to kill the children, weren't allowed to molest them or something, but there was very little health and safety regulation, and the curriculum was largely up to the school itself. But nowadays, the state has almost as much sway over independent schools as it does over state schools. There we are. Anyway, so why is Labour doing this? They say the existence of independent schools is unfair. It affords an independent advantage to the affluent who already have so many more advantages, as in bigger houses or private health insurance or bigger cars or more holidays and more libraries and better computers and all this kind of stuff. Cultural capital that some of the upper class and the upper middle class families have, that the working class or the lower middle class don't have. And then they get to go to these schools which are better funded per pupil, pay their teachers more, attract better teachers, have smaller class sizes, better equipment, better buildings, better grounds, more facilities in terms of a concert hall, a swimming pool, a golf course, games pitches, tennis courts, squash courts, and on and on and on. Okay, so Labour is trying to tackle regressive capitalism. Now, there's so many more ways they could do this. Remember the last Labour government? It's 10 years ago. They were bailing out. They were bailing out the major banks. So never in the field of human finance have so few owed so much to so many. It was a truly Churchillian moment when Brown tried to do that. Of course, there was never any guarantee that they were going to pay this back. The banks pay it back to the public at the commercial rate of interest. But anyway, we've been here before in terms of Labour talking about getting rid of independent schools. In the 1960s, a big movement in the early 60s, and indeed there was a socialist protest through the streets of Eton on the 4th of June. The so-called 4th of June is never held on the actual 4th of June. It's to celebrate King George III's birthday, and George III, though he never went to school, he only had private tutors up until, say, the 50s. Members of the British royal family never went to school. But anyway, he was very fond of Eton. It was across the river from Windsor Castle. He used to walk down Eton High Street chatting to the boys and giving them gold coins, and also chatting to the trees, because he was completely out of his tree, but he took the most lively interest in what was going on at the school. So the saying goes that when he died in 1820, the boys took off their tailcoats of many colours and went into mourning wearing black for his funeral. And almost 200 years later, the school still hasn't got over it. That's actually a myth, because there's a painting several years after 1820 showing the boys in coats of many hues. Only later on did the school stipulate that all tail suits had to be black. Anyway, so that was the idea of shutting down independent schools in the early 60s. Harold Wilson's Labour government came into office in 1964, and in fact they didn't do it. They had many more important things to do, and I don't think Wilson himself ever endorsed the idea. Certain sections of the Labour Party believed in that. And it was something that was really, well, actually in 1983, in the Labour Manifesto, Michael Foot advocated for that. And Gerald Kaufman, a veteran Labour MP, he famously said that Labour Manifesto was the longest suicide note in history. But in the early 60s, Eton had to have contingency plans just in case the UK government outlawed independent education. So it considered moving to the Republic of Ireland or France. So moving somewhere in the Dublin area in particular, good transport links, and Dublin has so much to offer in terms of theatres and so on, enough space for sports pitches, somewhere to row, things like that. Or likewise France, somewhere in northern France, around Paris or in between Paris and the Channel, as in easy for British parents to get to. In the end, of course, the contingency plans didn't need to be put into action. So Labour says this adds to inequality in our country, and just Musa Okwonga, an old Etonian who I knew very well, he published an article in The Guardian just the other day saying people feel so entitled and they're so lacking in sympathy for those less fortunate themselves, and Eton has a sort of very bad reputation for mass producing Tory MPs and exacerbating inequality. You rightly pointed out David Cameron was caught in possession of cannabis when he was a schoolboy by his housemaster John Faulkner, and if he didn't come from such an immensely fortunate family, Cameron might have gone to prison for that, gone to a young offenders institute, but he didn't, and it didn't mess up his life. That John Faulkner, apparently that man has died. He taught me Latin. Lovely chap, actually. Jack the Ripper, they used to call him, but not because he was a serial killer, because if your work was substandard, they would rip a bit of it to show you that your Latin translation wasn't good enough. That's called a rip. And he didn't actually give out very many of them, even though I was woeful at his subject. And the boys of his house supposedly rebelled against him. Prayers, an evening assembly, doesn't actually involve any praying. One time, all the boys refused to be house captain, the boys in the top here in his house, because the housemaster appoints a house captain, one of the boys, to have authority over the others, and they so loathed him and disrespected him that they refused to cooperate. So he supposedly on a trolley wheeled in a tin of peaches with stick-ups on it, as in a white bow tie, and saying, "This tin of peaches is going to be house captain from now on." It may be an apocryphal tale. That anyway, he couldn't really cope as a housemaster. I'm not sure if that is all veracious. So you get the idea between public schools, and there are around 300 of them in the UK. These would be the public schools club. As you've been to any public school, you could join this as an adult, and in London, just go and socialise there. Now it's now been absorbed into the East India Club, which is on St James's Square. St James's is just an area of London which is clubland, which has loads of these private member clubs. You must wear a suit to go in there. There's deep leather armchairs, a dining room, bars, libraries, even rooms to stay overnight if you happen to be from elsewhere. And people sometimes say private school, although that's not really accurate. These public schools are often charitable foundations. People say, where's the charity? Because they're not giving out many scholarships. They're just for the affluent. A charity for the rich is ridiculous. But, education is a noble cause. Now, they do hand out scholarships, but at Eton, a large number of boys, like at least a quarter, are on some sort of scholarship or bursary. They're King scholarships, they're music scholarships, they're music exhibitionists. As in, if you're fairly good at music, well, very good actually, you can get a music exhibition. Something off the fees. I think your music lessons are free. A music scholar, you're an outstanding musician, I think you'll get like at least 50% off, and you can get more off the fees if needs be. The King Scholarship Eton believes that every parent should have to pay something, even if it's just 1% of the fees. And they'll give you 50% off the fees quite easily. If you're a King Scholar, they might even give you 100% off. But that's very, very rare. But even the uniform is expensive. So there's this myth that it's all for posh boys. There's never been like that. It is true the majority of them are pucker. Okay? But look at Tony Little. He was headmaster of Eton from 2002 till, oh my goodness, about 2014, if I got that right. And his father was a baggage handler at Heathrow. Came from an unambiguously proletarian family. And Eton had a choir school, a little prep school. The town no longer exists. He was musically gifted. He sang in the choir. And then he got into scholarship into Eton itself when he was 13. And he went there. And he was as working class as they come. but he still speaks in my sort of accent. He said nobody in his family ever went to school beyond the age of 14. He went on to Cambridge. He became a schoolmaster, other schools, headmaster, back to Eton, blah, blah, blah. So it's not the case they're all out of the top drawer. But in fairness, it must be accurate. Yes, the majority of the upper class or very affluent to middle class. So like, if they're barristers or solicitors, they're highly successful ones, and doctors and so on, or loads of bankers and financiers, stockbrokers, army officers. Used to be quite a lot of Anglican clergy had their children there, top civil servants and so on, entrepreneurs, actors, film stars. Anyway, so public school providing these scholarships, but I remember at Ampleforth the scholarship was only worth about 10% of the fees, and people say, come on, that doesn't make the difference. The parents who could afford their daughter or son to go there anyway, okay, get the scholarship, it helps a little bit, but it doesn't make the difference between going there and not, very seldom. But is there a public benefit to these places? Well, they share their facilities with the local community. Like Eton got this national lottery grant in about 1997 to build an indoor sports arena, and some people were outraged, saying they're so rich, these parents. One of them could donate those several million quid and afford to build it, and Eton has got huge assets anyway. But Eton announced that local people would be allowed in to the sports centre to serve Pims and do the hoovering. No, not really. They do let the community use it, and they let the local community use their swimming pool for free and various things like that. So it provides lots of jobs for the cooks, the cleaners, as well as the teachers, and so it stimulates the local economy. It brings money in from abroad, all these independent schools. People from China and Russia, Nigeria, and wherever are studying in the United Kingdom. So it increased the UK's soft power. The United Kingdom has a more positive image abroad. And it's astonishing the way people just hate success in the United Kingdom, detest their most illustrious institutions, and don't celebrate it like people do in the United States. There's such envy. It's like Oxford University, rated the top university in the world by the World University Rankings last week, the top on earth. Out of all 193 countries, out of thousands upon thousands of universities, Oxford University is number one. A truly staggering achievement, especially in view of the fact that Oxford University has far less funding per undergraduate than the top American universities. The Ivy League ones are far better funded. Like Harvard has about 4 times more money per student than Oxford does. So it's astonishing the way Oxford is able to punch above its weight. And academic salaries are miserable in the United Kingdom. Until the 70s, they used to be reasonably good, almost keep pace with some of the other learner professions. But obviously, the UK has been hemorrhaging academics for decades, because people go off to the United States where they get paid thrice as much and all the rest of it. And there are loads of reasons why you wouldn't be an academic these days, as in just weighed down by paperwork. The government has poked its ugly nose in there, demanding this and forbidding that and all the rest of it, and having to produce more research papers is all about, I suppose, published papers, quantity not quality, and just harassed and told you're no good at teaching. Academic freedom is increasingly under threat. Anyway, so these schools bring in money, as I said, and what would happen? So these pupils would then go to the state sector. It's estimated that would cost at least £3.6 billion to the state sector. Now, some of these teachers who are in independent schools will go and work in the state sector, others would not. So they do produce fabulous results, some of these independent schools. Some of them don't, some of them are rubbish. I taught at some of them. Ampleforth is absolutely shit. You'd be better off if you try going to a comprehensive school. Just because it's expensive doesn't guarantee that it's good, and just because it's free of charge doesn't mean that it's bad. What would happen apart from this? So the wealthy people would still be allowed to hire private tutors. Are you going to ban that? Seriously, how would that work? You send people to prison for teaching a private lesson, or parents for paying a private lesson. Don't be ridiculous. So should the state be interfering in every tiny facet of our lives and controlling everything? This is control freakery. This is like a soft Stalinism. And the people just happen to live near Eton, get to go there. Perhaps that's the way they want to do it, use those buildings for something. But people, one of my left-wing friends who taught at an independent school, say, if you abolish independent schools, then the wealthy parents would just have their children going to the knobby state schools. They say, take Holland Park Comprehensive. Yes, it was a comprehensive, as in it took in all levels of ability. And Tony Benn's children went there. He was a far-left Labour MP because he lived very close. So it's a postcode lottery. If you happen to live in a rich area, then the schools tend to be better. as in the children are more middle class. Class children aren't necessarily clever or better behaved, but that's the way to bet. Working class children are not necessarily dim or badly behaved, but often that's the case, because, well, let's face it, genetics. Rich people have more money. Why do they have more money? It could be because they're brainier and that they work in higher paid jobs, generally speaking. Now, you don't have to be brainy to be in a high paid job. There's some well paid jobs which don't require brain power. Or indeed, you might have a lot of brain power but do a low paid job because you think it's socially worthwhile, like being a social worker or something like that, or working for charity, or just be whatever, unlucky. But some of the rather deprived areas, can I say, have high crime. A lot of the parents are in prison. A lot of the children never met their dad. Things like that. Very few books in the house. They can't afford a laptop. So they're educationally disadvantaged. They're harder to teach and things like that. So we would still have inequality in the system because of this. People going to their local school, living in the catchment area. But what's the other problem about living in a catchment area of a school? Well, I know people advocating abolishing independent schools could say, all right, we wouldn't get rid of inequality altogether, but we would reduce it. We wouldn't have such a huge concentration of privilege. So in these elite state schools, there tends to be more parental involvement, and there are more books in the house and things like that. And they still have their children privately tutored. I privately tutored people who go to state schools. So some state schools get fabulous results, and some independent schools are rubbish. I should know. I've taught at one of them, as I say. Anyway, so they just want to tear down excellence. Some of these left wingers. Tony Blair, he dropped this nonsense about abolishing independent schools. And why are things tough in some state schools? Well, partly there was outrageous behaviour is tolerated. You'd be sworn at to your face as a teacher a lot of the time. And one of my friends was told she was a fat fuck by an 11-year-old boy. Another boy said to her, "My dick is bigger than your boyfriend's," and things like that. And they get away with it. They're spoken to. That's it. Then your time is wasted with absolutely tons of paperwork. In terms of exams, there's revolution en permanence. Nobody knows what on earth is happening. They keep changing the system. They tell you they're going to change it, and then they actually don't change it. Then they do change it, and then they change it back 5 years later to the way it was originally, and they just never leave it alone. And they always get complaints from parents and complaints from pupils, and seldom get any praise. You're a whipping boy for the press, for politicians. Everybody has teachers they don't like, so they take it out on teachers generally. And you're going to have to disappoint people, you're going to have to discipline people, and the exam results won't always be brilliant. But when things go right, you don't actually get that much credit, and you can't be liked by everybody. So it's immensely stressful. No wonder there's a recruitment crisis. And there are other problems then. Yeah, well, partly underfunding. I think money's only a small part of it. Well, the worst thing that John Major did when he was Prime Minister was sell off the games fields, because I realise sports are quite important, even though I'm unsporty. Let off steam, get rid of your excess energy. It's better for your health, mental and physical, better for esprit de corps, everything like that. So there's so much vandalism of our educational system, and the Labour Party is really the worst of it. At least they said they're going to abolish Ofsted, the Office for Standards in Education. Well, there is much joy in heaven over every sinner who repenteth. Part of their control freak tendency, they wanted to regulate everything, to control everything, to collate data, to capture statistics, and they thought that everything had to be measurable. It was just maddening, and that the state should just butt out. In the good old days, James Callaghan, the Labour Prime Minister, 1976 to 79, he lamented that he had no sway over what was taught in even state schools. I kind of think, good. I can see there was a bit of a problem long ago when there were some ultra-left teachers who said, like, grammar is fascist and we mustn't teach them to spell, and proper English, that's just the bourgeoisie trying to make the proletariat feel stupid and things like that. Or just try to propagandize them. Now, you could have right-wingers propagandizing them, but in fairness, that almost never happens, because the political consensus in teaching is very much to the left, and in academia is far left, no question about it. Like there've been some communists who've been high up in British academia. I mean literally, like, say, Sir Christopher Hill, who was Master of Balliol College, Oxford, despite being viciously anti-democratic and being an outspoken advocate for an extraordinarily cruel totalitarian system, that didn't hold him back in his career one bit. So what's driving this new Labour policy? Spite, covetousness. It's got to sort of beggar my neighbour. If I can't have it, you can't have it, and I want to destroy it. And I knew I grew up feeling like a have. And by the time I was about 27, I began to feel like a have not. And I finally began to understand that attitude, they're driving around a big Chelsea tractor. Remember, out 2007, that was the saying, like a Range Rover or something like that, or a Land Rover. And some people are jealous. You have it, I can't have it. I hate you for having it. And if I can't have it too, I don't want you to have it. I want to destroy it. And there's something of this attitude of towards independent schools. So there are not many for-profit schools, but there are a few with shareholders. Because in public schools, because they're a charity, there are no shareholders, no profit. It's a charitable trust, and all the money is put back into the school, to the buildings, to savings, whatever, to more scholarships. But so I can see what rubs people up the wrong way about independent schools. The conceit of some of these people sneering at everybody else, those less fortunate themselves. There's the idea that they would spit champagne on the plebs, as in plebeian, that Latin word for working class people. And they have this sort of chair-born arrogance, and they get the lion's share of the top jobs. But there are other things, because then when they go to university, mummy and daddy pay the fees, and they can live off the bank of mum and dad and do unpaid internships a year, and all sorts of introductions are made and doors are open for them, things like that. They've also got some, and they're imbued with this great self-assurance, having been told they're the best, might lead them to believe they're the best, and then they can actually become the best, just confident about doing things, taking risks, applying for things that other people wouldn't. Because if it all goes wrong, they haven't lost everything, because they can go back to their parents. They've got a trust fund that's been set up by your grandparents when they die, and you can't spend it all at once. You get a little bit each year, and it's safely invested, known as trustafarians. That was a sort of a joke in the 1980s, a play on Rastafarian, a trustafarian who might be very trendy and sometimes left-wing, but then have a private income, have money, inheritance money, not all one big lump sum in case you splurge it or put it all up your nose in the form of Colombia's only export. But so you're giving it bit by bit, so you can't piss it up the wall. So I can see what annoys people about it. And I have met some children who are just extraordinarily stuck up and loathsome. I know you get that at all levels of society, but yes, you do get more of it amongst the wealthy. There's a rich kid stereotype of the spoiled brat who's got an unduly high opinion of himself, who's very up himself. And some of them are like that. Most of them are not. They might have little traces of it. Some of them are complete opposite. Likewise, there's the poor kid stereotype about how, they're so badly brought up and uncouth and rude and violent and all the rest of it. And okay, occasionally there'll be some who are like that. Most not really, and a few totally not. So there's good and bad in all social strata. Anyway, it's not going to work, because I remember in 2006, the Charities Commission, they ruled against independent schools over something or other. There was a court case on it for 5 years. Eventually, the courts found in favour of the independent schools that they really did have charitable status. Or one of Labour's ideas of putting VAT on school fees, value-added tax of 17.5%, to make the school fees even higher, even £42,000 a year, so get it up to £50,000 a year. All that means is some people who can just afford it won't be able to afford it anymore, and they'll be even more financially exclusive. This is crazy. And Eton's not the most expensive school in the UK, by the way, or in the world. That's Le Rosé, Institut Le Rosé in Switzerland, is, for example. And it seems to get dreadful results. The more financially exclusive you are, the less academically exclusive you can be. And by the way, I better explain what comprehensives were. Well, so we used to have this thing called the 11 plus, invented I think in the 1930s. You pass the 11 plus, this is a state school thing. You could go to a grammar school. The top 20% went to a grammar school, as they'd be learning grammar, could be Latin and grammar, Greek grammar, foreign language like French and German. But you also do math, science, do academic subjects. And then the other 80% could go to a secondary modern, as in there'll be no Latin, no foreign languages either. A bit of maths, a bit of science, minimal English, and they'll be learning woodwork, metalwork, prepared for a trade, maybe even hairdressing, cookery, domestic sciences, that means cleaning. And they'd leave school at the age of 14 and go straight into work. And there was no possibility of carrying on to university for them. A very few of them might go on to 16, but at grammar school, you could leave at 14, but I think almost nobody did. At 16, some of them would take exams called O-levels, ordinary levels, try and pass as many of those as you can. They were very hard. You even passed them, that's good news. And some people were leaving at 16, fairly academic people, working in a bank or a business or something like that. And if you're very bright, go on to school till 18 and take A-levels, as in advanced levels, usually in about 3 subjects, which are very demanding. And this was, so almost nobody stayed on to school till 18, and then about 2% of people went on to university. So we had grammar schools for the top 20%, and secondary moderns for the bottom 80%. and they believed that the 11 plus in English, maths, and science had scientifically proved at the age of 11 you wouldn't be able to pass O levels at the age of 16. But then some teachers in secondary moderns began entering their pupils for the O levels at 16, and some of them were passing them. So some people are early developers and then slow down and not very bright. Some people are slow developers, not very bright at 11, but they are very clever at 16. So it's not completely predictable. So anyway, from the 60s, they said, let's get rid of this, the Labour government, because they said the grammar schools are largely middle class, the secondary models are largely working class, and it's holding back working class children. So I think it was Tony Crosland, he'd been to Winchester College himself, and he said, I'm going to destroy every fucking grammar school in England and Wales and Northern Ireland. I don't think they didn't have them in Scotland, but it was then pointed out to him that London had no control over schooling in Northern Ireland. His wife was an American journalist. It was such a good quotation, she couldn't resist putting it down. And from the 60s and into the 70s, the Labour government, and sometimes Conservative governments, shut down grammar schools and, well, secondary moderns and grammar schools. They amalgamated them into comprehensive. They're called comprehensive because their range of ability is comprehensive. It takes in everything from the highest to the lowest. 11 plus exam, you might sit 11 plus just for information so that the school knows what your ability is, but they're not separating you into the top 20% and the lower 80%. So you're all together. But people said that was terrible because grammar schools, they were fantastic if you came from a working class family, and nobody in your school had been on to secondary education until then. Then if you got into a grammar school, you had a great opportunity to advance, to do O levels, to do A levels, possibly go to university, and some of them did, which if you went to a comprehensive didn't seem so possible, and if you went into a secondary modern, it was almost impossible. And that was that. So they were amalgamating them, turning them into comprehensives. Some comprehensives still have the name grammar school, like Watford Grammar School, even though it's actually a comprehensive. But it was done on a county-by-county basis, and some counties didn't do it. Buckinghamshire still has got grammar schools. I can't remember which other ones do, like Surrey or whatever. And so that was that. And by the 80s, it largely stopped. The Conservatives often worried it was a big mistake. Margaret Thatcher was Education Secretary 1970 to 74 in Edward Heath's cabinet, and she was often responsible for this, for bringing in comprehensive. Many Conservatives began to think it was a terrible mistake, and they've always talked about bringing them back. Cameron thought about bringing them back. It's never actually happened. And actually, the number of state school pupils going to Oxford and Cambridge was rising, sort of in the 1940s and the 50s and the 60s, partly because of the Butler Education Act, but partly because of grammar schools. And then it started falling in the 70s because there were comprehensives, and it was difficult to achieve such fabulous results in a comprehensive school. But and in the 80s was really low, something like 35% of people at Oxford had been to state school. It's now about 65%, and there we are. So that was that. But